10 years ago, Christian was forced to propose to his girlfriend. Jessica frightenedly shook the test in front of him, which showed 2 clear pink stripes. He was left with no choice. His father had always taught him to take responsibility and go all the way. A lot had changed in that time. Christian dropped out of school and pursued an entirely different profession. And his wife Jessica trained as a hairdresser stylist and was even able to open her own small salon. The couple had another daughter, and it seemed as if nothing could stand in the way of their happiness. Jessica and Christian were the closest people in each other's lives. The only thing that differed them was their temperaments in bed. They were so different that Jessica was literally going crazy. Alone with herself, she fantasized about other men. Then it was the trainer at her gym. Then the man she'd seen on the escalator across the street when she went down the subway in the morning. She imagined so vividly where, and more importantly, what could happen between them that sometimes these thoughts took her so far into the dream world that it was an impossible task to return to the real world. The woman realized that she was almost obsessed with the thought of cheating. Real adultery was not part of Jessica's plans, but these fantasies were taking up too much of her time. She was angry at herself, angry at her husband. Every time he refused her intimacy, she wanted to grab Christian by the shoulders and shake him harder. She wanted to scream in his face that she couldn't go on, but her conscience wouldn't let her do it. Her husband tried his best, but he could not keep up with Jessica's desires. The woman often thought back to the time when they had first met. They had nothing in common except their desire to be near each other and their infinite intimacy. No children, no responsibilities, and no household. They were so young, so carefree, that even now it seemed like a dream. Neither of them remembered what it was like to have as much freedom as you wanted. Each spouse now had so many responsibilities that they didn't always have time to do them all. Their favorite thing to do now was to take their evening smoke breaks together. They would put the children to bed, turn off the lights in the whole apartment, and meet on the balcony afterward. The spouses would sit on the floor on 2 sack chairs and look out through the city's smog-ridden panoramic windows into the distance. The only thread of supposed freedom that bound them together, their sinking into the cushioned armchairs, they were close to each other again, just as they had been 10 years ago. Christian was telling Jessica something, and she was listening silently and attentively. When they both crossed the threshold that separated the balcony and their bedroom, they would be different people again, man and woman swept up in the maelstrom of adulthood. The couple treasured those brief moments, trying to prolong them by smoking one after the other. What do you think would have happened if we divorced back then? Jessica asked one day, letting out rings of smoke from her mouth. I probably wouldn't have left the institute, and now I'd be working in a profession at a job I didn't like. And you'd have gone to the big city. Her husband smiled back at her, just as she had dreamed. The question that had been tormenting her wife lately was on her tongue. She hesitated to say it. Jessica knew that Christian would not like to hear her say it. But suddenly he himself, as if he could read her mind, said, I have no regrets, you know. Our family has given me more than I could have achieved on my own. Jessica was silent. She herself would never have been able to give an honest answer to such a question, and she prayed that Christian would not think of asking her. But her husband remained silent. Jessica met Dale at the cafe. It was lunchtime, and all the tables were taken. The man approached her and asked permission to sit next to her. Without even looking at him, Jessica nodded. She was engrossed in reading a new book, and she didn't want to be distracted by such little things. She could feel her neighbor's gaze drilling down on her. It distracted her reading and made her wildly irritated. She abruptly slammed the book shut and looked the stranger straight in the eye. The man was smiling contentedly. Only now she could see his unusual features and beautiful gray eyes. Well, why did you stop? He said, sipping his coffee. I liked it so much to watch you. You have so much emotion on your face. I don't like it when people stare at me. Jessica answered angrily. She was about to leave, but the stranger held out his hand to her. Please stay. I didn't mean to offend you." His smile was so disarming and inviting that Jessica's mind immediately flashed to images of undressing this man, of touching him with her hands. She shook her head to get away from her thoughts, which were completely out of place. The man introduced himself and asked about the book Jessica was reading. They got to talking. When it was time to leave, Dale asked for her number. After a moment's hesitation, she dictated the numbers and spent the rest of the day thinking only of him, of her new acquaintance. Their communication quickly turned from deliberately polite to more relaxed. Dale was increasingly picking Jessica up at lunchtime and taking her somewhere. To a hotel he'd rented for just an hour, to an apartment he called his own, or just away from the city. The woman stopped taking clients around lunchtime. She knew that she and her lover probably wouldn't make it back in time, and an unpleasant story could happen, and the client would be left unhappy. Jessica valued her reputation as a master more than anything else, and she didn't want a little thing like being late to ruin it. She did not hide her family from Dale from the beginning. The woman honestly told him that she had 2 daughters and a husband, and that she was on good terms with her husband. She made a decision not to lie to her lover, although she did not tell her spouse a word of truth. She carefully concealed her affair, frankly afraid of her husband's reaction. She failed to hide something else from Christian. He suddenly noticed that his wife had completely stopped demanding intimacy from him. When he asked her why this change had suddenly occurred, she didn't immediately know what to say and told Christian who knows what. Later, she bemoaned herself for such an oversight. After all, the change was noticeable from the love of an exuberant wife, who tirelessly demanded the fulfillment of her husband's marital duties. She became aloof and as if cold. She had to lie that her doctor had prescribed her pills, and that their side effect was diminished desire. She even pulled a bright yellow packet of vitamins out of her bag and shook them in front of her husband's eyes, hoping that he would believe her words. Christian smiled, nodding in agreement. Jessica exhaled a sigh of relief. Her secret affair was no longer a secret one day. Her spouse came to her salon to pick up her youngest daughter's phone, which she had forgotten in the car about her mother. The smiling receptionist girl told Christian that his wife had left for lunch and promised to be back by 1 o'clock. It was already 1:30 on the clock, and the man decided to wait for his spouse. As Jessica and Dale drove his car up to the parlor, Christian was just fuming standing near the porch. When he saw the woman he loved kissing a man he didn't know, Christian's eyes darkened with anger. He did not expect such a reaction from himself. But suddenly, he walked up to the car and sharply opened the door. He grabbed the dazed Dale by the jacket and began to pull him out of the driver's seat. When he finally succeeded, he punched him in the eye with his fist with all his might. His wife's lover grabbed the bruise and roared in pain. Jessica ran up to them, wanting to pull Christian away, but he made no more attempts to hit Dale and simply watched silently as a bruise poured over his opponent's face. The woman, making sure her lover was all right, walked over to her husband. There was no more distance between them than an arm's length away, and it seemed to both of them to be a whole chasm. Christian, trying not to look Jessica in the eyes, said, "My daughter forgot her phone. It's in your car. Open it, and I'll go get it. She's waiting at school." My wife nodded and looked in her purse for the keys and clicked the alarm. After getting what she wanted, the man drove away in silence. He was waiting for her in the evening at their usual spot. The couple almost simultaneously flicked a lighter and took a drag. The silence lasted forever. Finally, Jessica found the courage to tell her husband about her infidelity. She tried to speak in a way that didn't incriminate Christian, but it was getting out of hand. Today, it was the other way around. Jessica talked and her husband listened in silence. When the story was over, he extinguished the last cigarette and stood up. The man didn't give his wife a hand as he usually did. He simply walked out, closing the door behind him to more than just the balcony. The children took the divorce the hardest. The daughters could not believe that their beloved father would no longer live with them. The older girl, who understood a little more, resented her mother. She heard her father's words about cheating when he was on the phone with a lawyer and understood everything. 6 months after her lover's divorce, Dale moved in with her. They lived together for 3 years, and when Jessica announced to her common-law husband that she was pregnant, she didn't find a single thing of his in her apartment 24 hours later. The man had simply vanished without even leaving a note. She was left alone, trying to run a business at the same time, being a mother of 2 teenagers and waiting for another child. In the evenings, as she sat in her chair on the balcony, she wanted to howl with exhaustion and despair. The chair beside her was empty, and the finished pack of her ex-husband's cigarettes lay orphaned in a drawer of her desk. Such is the story. The next story is no less interesting. It tells the story of how a married boss fell for the flirtation of an employee, which she regretted very much. Verona and Leo had been married for 20 years. Their marriage was very early because it turned out that Verona was expecting a baby. They were only 17 when they got married, and 6 months later, they had a daughter who has now long since gone to live in another city. Verona had an expressive appearance, a tall, beautiful blonde that anyone would notice. She didn't look her age and often collected compliments about her. This year was the couple's anniversary of their life together, and Leo invited his wife to a restaurant. When he got there and saw Verona, he was once again amazed at how beautiful his wife was. She was dressed in a bright red, shapely dress and certainly drew attention to herself. "You look great," said her husband. He handed her a bouquet of flowers. "Thank you, darling." Verona answered, "I am glad you like it." They spent a pleasant evening together, laughing, remembering interesting moments from their lives. They even called their daughter by video link, and she congratulated them on their anniversary. "I have news. I'm being transferred to another department," Verona said, pushing her plate away from her after dinner. "Why?" My husband was surprised. "They need a supervisor there. It's a new department, and it needs someone who can train and guide the new employees." Leo was very proud of his wife. He offered to drink to this great news. "Then my next toast is to you, my beautiful wife," he smiled. Leo offered to walk Verona home. Just like in the good old days when they were still children, they avoided each other in the evenings. Verona gladly agreed. Marriage often lacks moments like that. They walked home through the park in the fresh spring breeze blowing in their faces, bringing the sense of blooming plants. Verona was very sad that moments like this were few and far between. 20 years of marriage had taken its toll on family life and dictated its own rules. The next day, Verona went to work. The woman loved it very much, though she could well afford not to go there, because Leo was making good money and could support the family. Today, Verona was scheduled to have an interview with a new employee. When she walked into the office, a young man was already waiting for her. She smiled at him and asked him to wait a little longer. After 10 minutes, she called him over and asked him to sit across from her. Of course, Verona couldn't help but appreciate the man's appearance. He was young, handsome, and his whole appearance indicated that he knew what he wanted from life. "Good day, my name is Verona." The woman smiled. "Hello, nice to meet you. I'm Max." The man smiled back, and Verona felt the heat inside her. It was the smile of a confident man, and it was very winning. They chatted. Verona even offered him coffee to stay in his company a little longer. She enjoyed talking to Max and wanted to learn as much as she could about him, even though she made the decision to hire him almost immediately. "Thank you for the interview. I would be very happy to have such an employee in our company. I hope you will be able to start work soon." "You scared me." Laughing nervously, Verona said, "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to." The man made coffee for himself and Verona and placed the cup with the flavored beverage next to the laptop. He sat across from her and watched her as she typed. "Please, in spite of me, you're distracting me," Verona asked. "I thought you liked my attention." Verona was embarrassed. Had she slipped up somewhere? And Max noticed that she was attracted to him. Well, don't be embarrassed. Do you think I don't notice the way you look at me and how you literally undress me with your eyes?" he added. Max got up from the desk, walked around the desk, and leaned over to, in a warm breath, touched her skin. She recoiled. "I have a husband." Not too confidently, she said. "Her husband is not a wall to move," Max replied in a whisper, and his lips touched her neck. It all happened so quickly that Verona didn't even have time to recover. Afterwards, she fed herself for her weakness, but at the same time she was happy. Max often began stopping by her office. He liked the feeling that they were not alone. But unfortunately, or fortunately, apart from these meetings, nothing else connected them, even though Verona tried to develop their relationship. One morning, she woke up with the firm intention of telling her husband everything. She decided that Leo did not deserve this deception. It was a day off, and Leo woke up later than his wife. So when he arrived in the kitchen, Verona was already drinking coffee. He thought his wife was acting strangely very nervous, and her hands were even shaking a little. "Do you have a headache?" Carefully, her husband asked. No, I do not have a headache. But I have something to talk to you about." And Verona told him all about Max, about her feelings for him, and what was going on with him at work. She had never felt so weak and defenseless as at this moment. She kept expecting Leo to start screaming, swearing, and maybe even throw something at her. But he took it calmly. "I guessed." Smiling sadly, Leo said, "Your behavior has changed. It's like you're 17 again. And I haven't seen you like that for a long time. That's why I sometimes thought you were seeing someone else. Why didn't you say anything?" Verona asked. She was shocked by what her husband had told her. "I didn't want to lose everything. If you admit it, I would have to leave. I could not live with you, knowing this information. It's one thing to guess, but it's another thing to know for sure." The two of them sat in the kitchen and were silent. They each drank coffee and thought about something else. Verona had many more words in her head that she had been preparing to say to her husband, but didn't have to. She felt like a traitor who had ruined someone else's life. Perhaps she would have felt better if her husband had actually yelled at her. How coldly he took the information to heart made her soul feel even worse. "What shall we say, daughters?" Verona asked in a whisper. "Let's tell her the truth. She is a big girl, and I think she will understand. We are all adults and understand that bad things in life happen from the indifference and coldness of her husband." Verona wanted to howl. She understood that he had chosen the right tactic. He wanted to give her some of the pain she had brought him. They divorced, dividing all the property they had accumulated. Leo fulfilled his dream and bought himself a house by moving out of town. It was something he had always wanted very much. But Verona was a city dweller, and out of solidarity with his wife, he did not buy a house. But now that he was free, he could afford everything. Despite the fact that Verona was a woman quite independent, it was very difficult to build her life anew. She could have been fired for having an affair in the workplace, but she still risked telling Max about her divorce and didn't get the reaction she had hoped for. She told him that now they cannot hide. If necessary, she will arrange it in another firm, and then their relationship will not be threatened. He laughed and said he didn't want a relationship. He liked everything as it was, because that was all he wanted. Verona was hurt after his words, and she realized that by betraying herself, she had also been betrayed. After this news, she cried all day in her office, and later, not being able to stand being with Max every day side by side, she submitted her resignation and ended up losing both her husband and her good job because of her weakness. Of course, she found another job without much trouble, but she could no longer regain her former peace of mind. The woman constantly thought about how horribly she had treated her husband for the sake of momentary pleasure, and the guilt did not give her peace. Her daughter was also angry with her after what had happened. Verona was so trapped by these thoughts that her constant state of nervousness left little of her former beauty. She started to binge on stress, and then the booze got involved. From once an attractive woman who had everything, she turned into a completely ordinary, abandoned by all the cheater. So that's the story. Share in the comments what you think about this situation and the behavior of the characters.